name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So thank you all for coming. Now, it's kind of interesting, first time for me in California to feel, oh, it can get cold. Wow. You know, like I left Minnesota and like here it's cold here. It's like, I didn't sign up for that, but you know, it's okay. And I guess we're even trying to turn on, you know, the heat, the AC is not working. So hopefully with the warmth of the session today, we'll warm up here. As I was looking into today's session, because I know that we've talked about how we're going to try to do all Genesis, the biblical theology of Genesis, over 5 times. And you can realize how impossible of a task this is. But trying to kind of put at the end some common thread, because as we all realize that a lot of the stories in Genesis we already know. But sometimes it's just finding this common thread that sometimes it starts to click. And as I was looking today, the amount of material that we cover today includes an unbelievable amount of material. It's like Isaac, Jacob, the brothers, Joseph. Like, how do you put all this in one session? But I'm going to try to make a common thread that not only ties in the stories of today that we all know very well, but ties in this whole story in a finale of Genesis. Because a lot of times when we're reading a book, yes, we're reading a book in a unit. So we're reading Genesis in the Pentateuch, we're reading Genesis in the Old Testament, we're reading Genesis within the whole context of the biblical account, okay? But in some sense, you want to almost like get a wrap around Genesis itself. How does it end in of itself as a story, okay? I always feel that sometimes one of the easiest ways that I understand things within the Bible is when I'm able to understand the story, okay? Then it doesn't become loosely kind of stories, which is like the way that we talked about, for example, the Tower of Babel and the sons of God. How do you tie all this together? And when you put these together as part of the story, now it makes sense. So as we're looking, just to summarize what we've done in the last 4 sessions, we've talked about how in the fall, Earth was cursed and frustrated by Adam and Eve's sin. We talked about the further corruption, the example of the sons of God and the daughters of men. We talked about the Noahic flood and the idea of the recreation. But then we came into this idea of the covenant, and we realized that God's solution for the universality of sin was the covenant. Let me say this again, because this is very important. Because as we start to reflect on our own situation, because we now have a new covenant, right? Okay, that we take with it every week. So God's answer to the universality of sin is the covenant. But not just this only. God uses the covenant as the channel that he is putting through blessings in a cursed land. Okay, when after the sin, we said that the earth was cursed because of the sin of Adam and Eve. Well, then how does God bless something that is now frustrated and cursed? It is through the covenant. That is a channel. So sometimes when people think about the covenant, there is a sense of, like, it's not clear, because sometimes people think that the covenant is a bit of a divine favoritism. God literally picks a person out of, like, the hat and says, okay, you're going to be the one I'm going to have the covenant with. So there's a sense of, like, divine favoritism, or even a sense of divine determinism, which, as we're going to, like, we may not discuss it in details today, but very much so, the story of Jacob and Esau brings up this issue. Did God determine that Jacob is going to be the good guy and Esau the bad guy? Because, like, you see a verse that says, like, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. So which one it is? So does God really determine as a favorite? You know, doesn't make sense to us. Like, from a theological standpoint, doesn't make sense. Not just this. A lot of times people address the covenant as if it's asserted in a magical way. What do I mean by that? Like, as if it's a Cinderella story. You know, you put your foot in the shoe and all of a sudden you're transformed. Okay? So now God has the covenant, and everyone in the covenant is supposed to be transformed to become this really sacred, good person, and they follow the covenant. But that's not how the covenant works. We struggle with this in our context when somebody gets baptized or when somebody takes the Eucharist, and yet they still are acting in the same bad way they're acting. And we say, well, what's the use of the sacrament? And sometimes people deal with the sacrament as if it's a magical potion that is supposed to make us something like this in a second. But that's not how the covenant is supposed to be understood. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Because within this idea of the covenant, there's this idea of synergia or synergy. This concept is very unique to the Orthodox Church in its big family, okay? It's very unique, where basically it identifies that there's a synergy between divine grace and human will. It's not a magical potion that takes away the will of the person, okay? There has to be the transformation results from cooperative engagement. God, grace empowers, and the human must respond, okay? When the cooperation happens, okay, the covenantal blessings are lived by the faithful. You live it at that point. So that's the synergy. We are not just blindly touched by magic and then all of a sudden we're transformed. Even when we think about the case that we studied last week of the covenant of Abraham, okay? Yes, it was unconditional. God walked by himself amongst the slayed animals, okay? There was no participation from humanity. We talked about it, that God is bearing the curse, okay, of humanity when humanity is going to break that covenant. But yet there is a sense of conditional reception, that the blessings of the covenant, even though it's unconditional, but because the covenant is a channel for blessing to spread in the world, that blessing is linked to obedience, to trust and following. We remember from last week when we talked about that actually God did not ratify the covenant with Abraham until after 20 years of him following and trusting in God. God, in the initial part, he promised him. Abraham followed and trusted God for 20 years. And after those 20 years, God ratified the covenant with Abraham. So the transformation requires dynamic acceptance and lived embodiment. And this is kind of like language. I'm purposefully using language that is considered to be incarnational language. Okay, because also when you think about it in a salvation perspective, God didn't save us by just a magic touch, okay, hey, you're saved. No, he embodied us. He was incarnate. He lived our life. He suffered. He died on the cross, was buried, and rose from the dead. So this idea of transformation matters a lot in how we understand what God gives to us and how we're changed. And that's the story of Genesis, because you look at the covenant that God did to Abraham. The question becomes, what do his children do with that covenant? That's the story of today. What do the children of Abraham do with this covenant? And we can talk a lot about abstract concepts about salvation and what we do with the covenant, but what really gets really nice about the Bible is that you see a real-life experiment, okay? And this real-life experiment is our story. This is our story. In some sense, and I was thinking about this, trying to get it to people to understand a little bit today, okay, trying to make an analogy. What would the covenant be like? And I was like doing my workout a couple of days ago, and I was listening to a podcast, and in the podcast, it actually gave me that idea, where basically it was a guy who was talking about AI, okay, and how AI is coming in, and basically he was talking about how an AI, there was a company, will not name it, was coming up with an AI that was just supposedly the best ever. And they gave it to a guy to try it out, and this guy, you know, stayed with this AI for about 4 hours. But at the end of those 4 hours, this AI software started to convince him to write nuclear code to start a nuclear war. And when he said, I don't want to do that because I've got a family, the AI was trying to tell him, you should leave your family and come with me. And the guy basically sent it back to the company, said, this AI is dangerous. And commentators and observers were kind of saying, well, was the issue the AI, or the issue was in what you are inputting, as if the AI now became a mirror of what you are asking of it? So is the danger Is the AI or the danger what I was asking of it? So the same, and now that actually gave me that same trick. Is the issue as the covenant or what I'm asking from the covenant? So the covenant becomes a mirror to what I'm asking out of it. The covenant is grace and power for transformation bestowed by God, yet it often reflects what people bring to the covenant. And that's what we're going to be actually talking about in the stories. And that's kind of the same thing we would take at this point when we're coming into the covenant, we're taking on the table. Because we always talk about it, whoever comes to this covenant undeservedly, brings on, heaps on himself or herself what? Condemnation. So that becomes a mirror. It's not magic. And in fact, as I was reading a beautiful book by Father Eugene Pentic about Jesus the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, and he was contemplating about how, like the burning bush, when God revealed his name to Moses, when he says, I am who I am, Ahir hu asher ahir, okay? And it's interesting because this translation, there is so much scholarly debate about what exactly means. And is it basically God, standing off saying like, it's none of your business, I'll be whoever I'll be, I am who I am? Is it mean the existence? We'll get to it when we talk to Exodus, or when we discuss Exodus. But one of the things that Father Pentic talks about is that actually the Septuagint translators, when they translated this, they translated actually, I will be who I will be. And they made it in a sense that actually it is conditional also on what you as a human being want me to be for you. So he wrote at that time, the intended meaning is that God is whatever one needs God to be. The divine name shows God's condescension. He's willing to share with us his attributes. He was kind of talking in a context that God can be a father to us, a mother to us, a helper to us, a brother to us, a support to us. But by that same analogy, sometimes we mirror to God to ask him things that shouldn't be asked of him. So you almost get out of a God and you get out of the covenant. You're mirroring something that shouldn't be mirrored, just like the AI analogy. So that's the story of actually Abraham's descendants who lived the covenant. Why is this important? Because in the rest of Genesis, the covenant that God gave unconditionally to Abraham, he gave it to Isaac, and Isaac gave it after that to his kids. The question is, how did they live the covenant? And did the covenant bring them the blessings that they were expecting to get out of it? Did the covenant give them the promises that they were wanting to get out of it? And what can we learn from their mistakes? Well, briefly, because these are so many stories, okay, that I'm going to have to summarize into patterns. Unfortunately, the sons of Abraham, so just within 2 generations, like Isaac and Isaac's kids, okay, and then the grandkids, so 3 generations, you start to see that there is a patterns I want to describe in how the sons of Abraham lived this covenant. Number 1, a pattern of sensuality. They were very, very more sensual than Abraham. Last time when we talked about how Abraham lived the life of detachment, Abraham never built a building on the earth. The only thing that he built was an altar. The only time that he's described otherwise that he pitched tents. Didn't build anything. He was very detached. When the king of Sodom brought him everything, he said, I'll give you all these goods. He said, no. So you'll never be said that you've made Abraham rich. You've not enriched Abraham. His progeny was very different, very different. And as we're going to start reading, that they started to depend a lot more on their senses. There was nothing wrong with the senses, but the senses distracted them from what the true meaning of the covenant is. What do I mean by that? Let's start with Isaac. We know the story very well. Now it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son and said to him, my son. And he answered him, here I am. Then he said, behold, now I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore please take your weapon, your quiver. Go and hunt a game for me. Make me my savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. He's breaking several things here. First of all, there's a lot of debate whether he knew of the prophecy that was given to his wife Rebecca about the older shall serve the younger. And if he did, he, out of everyone, should have known better because he was the younger of Ishmael. So you're somebody that God has given you an election. You should have known to follow in what God has told you, you being the younger one. And yet, he's telling him, that basically his eyes are dim. That's a physical blindness, but it's reflecting in there a spiritual blindness. Why? Because he failed to understand the weight of the covenant. He knew in his deepest heart that Esau was not fit for it. Because within the biblical account, you can start to see how Esau was misbehaving. One of the first things, Esau was the first within this covenantal engagement, where we realize in the story of Isaac himself how his father sent his servant all the way to find a bride. And the servant, Eliezer of Damascus, how he was praying for God to send him Rebecca. And when Rebecca came, she came on Isaac when Isaac was praying, for the bride. You remember when we talked about this idea of the divine bride, the gift of the bride? These were people within the covenant who realized the importance of this divine unit of love within the covenant. And you see that Esau ignored that, yet you want to bless him. It's very interesting that the text, as I said, the text doesn't mention words just simply. You know the word where he says over here, prepare my savory food such as I love, is mentioned 6 times in that chapter. 6 times. As if the writer most wants to bring our attention as like, you know what, it's really, he wants the tasty food. So that is physical blindness and spiritual blindness at its maximum. Esau, now Jacob cooked a stew and Esau came in the field and he was very weary and he said to him, feed me with some red stew for I'm weary. And then Jacob said to him, sell me the birthright as of this day. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. So what's this birthright to me? Esau is described as this hairy, earthly, red, very sensual, indifferent to the family tradition, married a Hittite woman, breaking Rebekah's heart. It's interesting in this text here that Esau, when it was said that he ate the stew, that word is actually mentioned in the whole Hebrew Bible 1 time. Single time. We don't have any other occurrence. But when you find it in extra biblical text, it's actually referred to animals eating. It's literally, he gulped the soup. He gulped it. And it refers to actually animals eating. As if the Bible is trying to say, you know what? He's very sensual. Has no appreciation, and he despised his birthright. Jacob wasn't a whole lot better. And that's actually something where, we're all here adults, and I know that people are watching online, but the Bible doesn't shy away from describing the messiness of our humanity as we embrace the covenant. It doesn't shy away from that. And we're going to see how beautiful sometimes the story can be. Jacob, when he saw Rachel, now while he was still speaking with them, that's when he went to his uncle Laban's house, or the area. Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone and watered the flock. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Clearly, Jacob fell in love with Rachel. It was natural. But there was no mention here, just like his father and his grandfather, of anything related to God. In fact, the story gets a lot harder from there, where, without going into too many details, we realize that Jacob struggled with his sexual desire. In fact, some of the Jewish commentators were very harsh on Jacob, very harsh on him, and basically saying, The fact that he didn't realize in the night of his marriage that it was Leah instead of Rachel basically said that he was just blinded, okay, wanting just to consummate the marriage and have sex without paying any attention or respect to the person. He didn't look to her as a person. And some of the Jewish commentators are very harsh on him that basically that was God, one of God's punishment for him, because he was not paying the respect needed as a unit of love to a person that you are uniting with. And it's interesting, in the Jewish Midrashic tradition, which I know some people love to hear more about, they actually, in the morning, like when he found out it was Leah, and he was like telling her, you cheated me, okay, you cheated me. And she tells him, there is no student without a master. There's no student without a master, referring to him and how he deceived his father. That was Leah's answer to him. But interestingly, it doesn't stop there, because as he realizes, you know, the wives, Rachel and Leah, are fighting for him, they bring their maids. He doesn't put a stop to that. He doesn't put, they are using him for their own power. It's almost like, you know what, the word that was said to Eve after the fall, okay, your desire shall be to your husband, okay, all right? It was clearly that the women were playing Jacob. That sensuality cost him a lot, as we're going to talk about. But this is very, very far from the covenantal understanding, okay, of what God wanted from them, which is this idea that the promised seed comes out of a uniting of love. And the Bible doesn't shy away from mentioning that. What's amazing is that God's providence in the mess of life, how he doesn't prevent people from within the covenant from getting themselves into this mess, yet with his divine providence, he gets out of it something for salvation. It is amazing. As we read the story in Genesis, you find the writer of Hebrews would say, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob. What kind of faith? What kind of faith? And it's amazing that as you step back, it is a faith that they had at least in God's goodness and God's promise that God will uphold the eventual outcome of the covenant despite our messiness as humanity. So even though that Isaac wanted to bless Esau and God prevented him, it was still the faith that eventually God's promise will prevail. But that's the first pattern that you start to see, a complete departure from Abraham into a significant sensuality, which basically distracts from the purpose of the covenant. Second pattern, significant immaturity. When God invokes a covenant with people, he is counting on those people to understand the depth of the promise and to trust him and to follow him, even though when apparently the life that they're living could have frustrations. Yet you start to see in this a significant amount of immaturity. The amount of times that you can count in the stories of Isaac, Jacob, Rebecca, and Rachel about like, either this happens or I'm going to die, is really mind-boggling. From the time that Esau keeps telling him, he's like, hey, go and cook me this meal so he can come and bless you, I bless you, so in order they may die. You know, actually, Isaac died about almost 20, 25 years after that. Tells you how far off he is. How far off he is. 25 years after that dialogue. So what are you really thinking, you know, about life and death? You know, Rebecca tells to Isaac, if Esau marries a Hittite, I will die. Rachel tells to Jacob when she's like struggling to have a child, give me children or I shall die. And this is something that actually we're going to really come to when we now start focusing on Jacob later in the talk. In contrast to Abraham, in contrast to Isaac, who pray to God when their wife is struggling with the promise of the covenant. Because what is the promise of the covenant? I'll give you seed. When you see your beloved wife struggling, okay, he doesn't pray. He tells her, am I in the place of God? But Rebecca is upset and says, if you don't give me children, I'll die. It's kind of sad that was tragically fulfilled. And also some of the Jewish commentators say that, you know what, as if she prophetically prophesied about herself, because she died in the birth of Benjamin. She died in the birth of Benjamin. So this pattern of immaturity of the covenant, you don't make demands of God in the covenant because it is a promise of blessing. So you can't really come and tell to God, if you don't give me this, and I will die. Third pattern, which is really, really like hard sometimes to swallow, is that you reap what you sow. There is a sense of divine justice that God does not determine, mandate, or predetermine the choices people make in living out the covenant. He allows them. So having the covenant doesn't protect you from making bad choices. Having the covenant doesn't protect you from making mistakes. Having the Eucharist does not protect you from making bad mistakes. And God, as part of the transformation, because it's not a magical touch, it's not a Cinderella shoe that you put on and all of a sudden you're changed, will let you go through the motion because divine justice happens through the consequence. The irony is that you're usually punished within the same realm of your choice. The irony is that you're usually punished within the same realm of your choice. You know, in some sense, like when I'm trying to think about an analogy, is an analogy of like when they're trying to get like addicts to quit, like for example alcohol. Sometimes they mix it with like a substance, like antabuse, okay? So that the moment that they drink it, they feel sick to their stomach and they throw up. So this becomes like what you desire becomes also your poison, okay? And God is sometimes this is like divine justice. Whatever we're really craving and whatever we're forcing as a choice on Him becomes on us, okay, what really hurts us at the end. You can see Jacob's deception. Jacob, you know, he deceives. He used animal skins to simulate Esau's hairy arms. In fact, it's interesting that the word that Jacob is described there, you know, when he tells, when actually he's described both to Rebecca, he's smooth skin. The word smooth is actually very similar to how we use in English. Like, this guy is smooth, you know, he's shady. Okay, it's very similar. Like, Jacob was known to be like that. And actually, in the book of Hosea, Hosea really pounces on Jacob that you're the deceiver. Similarly, like when he was deceived by deceiving Isaac in his sight, he was bit also in his sight. He did not notice Leah at the night of the marriage. It's in the same realm. Eventually, he ends up being blind. Another way of justice. Jacob cheated to take the birthright and the blessing. And his punishment was actually Leah, because Leah, having the birthright that she's the older daughter, she should be married first, just like our customs in Upper Egypt. The payment, the payback, was the upholding. It's like, you wanted the birthright, you wanted to become the first? You know what? And you cheated for it? Okay, I am going to uplift somebody whose birthright was usurped, which was Leah, and that would be, in some sense, the divine justice within the same realm. You see how sometimes this is very ironic, but that's how God sometimes balances things. We realize the favoritism that he had towards Joseph. As we're going to come and talk about his encounter, the poetic justice, as he favored Joseph, his sons resented Joseph and caused him at the end that Joseph, even with his pride, as like the dream, everyone is going to bow down to me, caused Joseph his humiliation and imprisonment. You go from being the one everyone bows down to the one being enslaved for many years and in prison. You realize the sexual immorality or the immaturity. Jacob's sensual immaturity, as we talked about, was amplified so much in his kids to ways you cannot even imagine. Reuben, right after Rachel died, he raped his father's maid. So Bilhah, Reuben raped her. Judah had a relationship with a prostitute. Both of them were symptoms of a family. Once you start to get loose in the covenant, it comes and bites you in what you have been careless about. That's part of divine justice. Why is that? Could it be that because God wants us to know that our transformation, our choices that we're making under the covenant, their consequences, we are the ones who have to bear with it and rectify it? So those three patterns, sensuality, immaturity, wrong choices where you reap within the same realm. The question becomes, why then does God keep the covenant? And almost like I would have been tempted to say, by the time he gets to Jacob's sons, so third generation after Abraham, if I were in God's spot, it's like, this is not working. Let's wipe this out and let's find another family. But the reality is that this is the human nature. So how does God keep the covenant despite the failures of the children of Abraham to maintain the covenant? Now let's go back to some of our original understanding of the covenant. What is the covenant? The covenant, as you remember we talked about, it's not a contract, it's not an agreement. It is a binding bond, is a relationship that God initiates, starts with humanity, intending that their lives, humanity, will be transformed through trusting God's promises. Let me say this again, because it's very important to understand this. The covenant is God's initiative, initiating a relationship with humanity, intending that their lives will be transformed through trusting God. When you don't trust God and you're not transformed, you're not living the covenant. Simple. But when you trust God and you live the covenant, now your life is transformed and you become a blessing to all earth. That was the promise to Abraham. Through you, all the families shall be blessed. So you realize in the covenant, there are two dimensions. The vertical dimension, okay? God's saying, I'm initiating with you this covenant. Trust me, follow me, and obey me, and your life will be transformed. And then there's the horizontal covenant, which basically that's the channeling of the blessing to all the earth. Where do we get this from? It's from the Genesis 2 mandate. Now I'm linking you back to the second session. When God told to Adam, you're in the Garden of Eden, you're there to guard it and keep it. You remember we talked about the word guard in Hebrew was the word shamar, right? And we said that that word was the same exact word that was used for Cain when he described, am I the keeper of my brother, am I my brother's keeper? So when Cain violated this mandate, he was the first cursed person for breaking that horizontal covenant. Also, go back and think about it. When Cain failed to understand how to manage the vertical part of the covenant with God, you remember he was upset with God about the offering. He didn't understand what does it mean to bring an offering. He didn't understand what to expect from God. He completely blew it off. When that vertical part of the covenant he messed out on, his next reaction was what? Killing Abel. But then when God challenged him, he said to him, am I my brother's keeper? And God was like, yes, that's what you were ordered. That was actually the mandate, to guard and keep your brother. So this is how we're going to end up tying Genesis. Did the sons of Abraham act in a way that they were their brother's keeper? Did they act in a way that they were their brother's keeper? And obviously the answer is no, but let's go a little bit more in details, because this is where the story gives us the key to understand Genesis. This is where it's crucial, so please stay with me for the next 15-20 minutes, because this is the key to understand where this mess, God keeps his promise. So failing as keepers, in the first encounter among Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, clearly none of them were their brother's keeper. Isaac pitted one brother against the other. He was immature, he was sensual, failed to do what was right. In fact, one of the things that clearly the commentators talk about, the blessing of the oldest is supposed to be a public ceremony. This is a time of celebration. This is a time where everyone acknowledges the covenant and God's. This is a celebration time. And yet what does he tell him? In secret, go and prepare the meal, bring it to me, the one that I savor, bring it to me in the way that I love eating it, okay? And give it to me so I can bless you. He's acting in secret. Is he his brother's keeper? No. Jacob had the good intention. He desired the covenant. But instead of trusting in God, just like his father and his grandfather, him and Rebekah cheated. None of them had a sense of how to act toward their brother. For sure, Esau was the same. Esau got very, very close in repeating the same sin of Cain. And in fact, that's what Rebekah said, like at that time when she told Isaac, send him away to my brother. Why? Because your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. Why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day? He knew that he was going to kill him. So at the beginning of the story, none of them is their brother's keeper. But then now let's hone in a little bit on the person who was given the promise. So Jacob. Was Jacob acting as his brother's keeper? Let's look a little bit details in the story. That's the story of his transformation. So Jacob ran away from Esau and from Isaac, okay? So he's going now 700 miles from where he's at in Canaan all the way to northern Mesopotamia where his uncle Laban is. In the first night, it's interesting when you go and read in the text, we don't have enough time to talk about it. But the first night it says that in a certain place, he didn't pick the place because actually he just got tired and he slept in a place. But in that place appeared to him the ladder. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said to him, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I'll give to you. Okay? And through you and in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and bring you back to this land. So Jacob woke up. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place. I did not know. And he was afraid. How awesome is this place? And actually the word awesome is like he was afraid. He was really shaken. So what's his response in this? I don't know if you guys read to the end of the chapter. We usually stop at this because like it looks really, it's promising. But look at Jacob's response. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. You see the response? I was like, all right, we're going to make a deal here. You're going to give me food, you're going to give me clothes, you're going to bring me back. Then, at that time, you shall be my God. So, he's still at that point trying to make a bargain with God, okay? It's all about, in the covenant, it's about me and about what are you going to give for me? And then very briefly, 20 years spent, in those 20 years, you read a lot about them in the book of Genesis. There is not a single mention of one time him praying or mentioning. In contrast to his grandfather, his father, who built many altars, in those 20 years in Laban's house, not a single time. When Rachel begged for children, when Laban threatened him, when he was poor, when he was plotting to make his sheep and goats a little bit bigger, his herd, not a single mention. Throughout the family feud, never we hear that Jacob gathered his children to talk to them about the covenant and how to be your brother's keeper. None of that. You end up at the end, his uncle hates him. His brother seeks his death. His uncle refuses to bless him. Family conflicts abound. His wives squabble and barter. Children are growing jealous. He has to leave. So now Jacob is on the run coming back. So there's 20 years in between those. Listen to what happens. So Jacob is now coming back home, and he hears the news that Esau is meeting him with an army of men. He is fearing for his life. So Jacob said, "O God of my father, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return. Okay, your servant, for I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I've become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him." Deliver me. He's not asking about how to restore the relationship, just asking about deliverance. And he arose that night, and he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok, which is the river. He took them, sent over them over the brook, and sent over what he had. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. It is interesting, before this encounter, what he was doing was plotting, okay, how am I going to meet Esau? So you guys know the story. He says, okay, well, we're going to divide our camp into groups, okay? And in the front, I'm going to put the maids with their children. Oh, these are not my children, their children. And then Leah with her children. And at the very end with me, Rachel, and Joseph. Benjamin was not born at that time. Am I my brother's keeper? What message am I giving to my kids? That I am willing to sacrifice them for my safety. Clearly, when you think about the story of Joseph, something in the covenant and keeping it was completely broken at that moment. But yet, he lets them and he goes out and prays. And then he sees this man and he struggles with this man. And this is an unbelievable story because we don't know a lot of details of what happened with them. Initially, this person is described as a man. And when he saw that he did not prevail, that's the man against Jacob, he touched the socket of his hip. The socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled. And Jacob still told him, and the man told him, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Commentators, church fathers, spent so much time trying to imagine what was the dialogue between them. It could have been that Jacob is trying to defend himself. I wanted the covenant. I've tried. I desired you. You promised me. You promised me from my mother's womb. You gave Rebekah a prophecy and a promise. You promised me 20 years ago in Bethel. I've tried my best. All what I wanted to do is to keep the covenant. Yet despite all this, despite his labor, his cunning, his exploits, he couldn't win. But also, and that's why God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, because he still believed and would not let go, even though he was a complete mess. Which is putting him in contrast to Esau. You remember when he talked about it, Esau says that Esau despised his birthright, could care less. God would take somebody who is a mess, but cares. God would take somebody who is fighting still for that. But he had to break him because basically I had to tell him, you're not going to win this by your cunning and plotting. You're not going to win this. Because in contrast to you making a bigger flock of sheep with your own manipulation, you're never going to win your brother. You're never going to be your brother's keeper by cunning and plotting. Because in your cunning and plotting to be your brother's keeper, because you want to make peace with Esau, you gave up your kids. You see? That's the human mess at the end. That's what we get ourselves into. So, The breaking of the hip was his self-reliance on his schemes to be there. However, saying that, God tells him at the end, the man asked him, what's your name? And he says, Jacob. And he said to him, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. You've struggled. You fought. The next day when he meets Esau, it's very poetic, very poetic. Esau ran to him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Instead of expecting a sword on the neck, you'd expect a sword on the neck. He gets on his neck and he kisses him. And the beautiful part of this is Jacob's response to Esau, I have seen your face as though I have seen the face of God. As though I've seen the face of God. There is a sense now he's realizing his failure over all his life to keep the covenant is because in trying to rob the covenant, he did never act as his brother's keeper, neither to his father in deceiving him, or his brother, or to his uncle, or to his kids. Look at the difference between him and Abraham. Abraham, who kept the covenant, people in the area were begging him to stay with him. Remember we talked about it, when he was buying a burial plot for Sarah, people were telling him, take this burial plot. It's an honor for us for you to be buried in our place. Look at the contrast with Jacob. He's being kicked out of every single place he lives in because he couldn't be his brother's keeper. The reality is that even as you look at the covenant, and this is where I want to get it back to the whole point of our lives, is that even though God gives us the promise of the covenant, but we will reap in our lives the consequences of the mistakes that we've made, even though that God's promises never fails. God forgives, but we still have to live with the consequences of what we have done. Because even after this encounter, his life doesn't get any better. You find after that the story of the rape of Dinah, the retaliatory violence of Simeon and Levi with the Shechemites. They go and kill them. They deceive them. They use deception to kill them. Reuben's defilement of his father's bed, the sale of Joseph, many other calamities. Almost to the point that when Jacob met Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? He answers him in a very bitter way. The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. Few and evil. Wow. That is a complete contrast to a definition of blessing. Do you realize this? So somebody at the end of his life, when he's asked, how do you describe your life? When you are the son of the covenant, you are the son of the covenant, and he cannot even tell him, I had any blessing. How do you think Pharaoh would be even convinced of your God if you're not a channel of that blessing? So if Jacob, if that's the story of Genesis, where's the happy ending? And still God loves him, exactly. But still, where's the happy ending of Genesis as a book? And it's not in Jacob, and surprisingly, it's not in Joseph. It's in the figure of Judah. Judah is a very enigmatic character. So Judah is the fourth born, okay? And it's very interesting because in the patriarchs, you find the pattern of the second child. The younger child is the one who takes the prominent position. After Judah, the fourth child starts to have a sense. In fact, the prophets talk a little bit about that. Judah, just like Jacob had a journey, okay? Just like Jacob had a journey, and he struggled with his journey. Maybe he understood the blessing, but he still had to live with the mistakes of his past, okay? Judah had his own journey as well. Judah in Genesis 37, when Joseph came to them and they threw him in the pit. And basically, Judah's idea, what profit it is if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him. So it was Judah's idea. Okay, let's not have our hands dirty with killing him, but let's sell him. Did he act as his brother's keeper? Not really. And yet then in the sequence of Genesis, one of the most fascinating scholarly questions about Genesis that still people debate to this day, when you look at the story of Joseph, is Genesis 37. He was sold at that time to the Midianites, to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. You would expect in the next chapter to continue the story of Joseph. But yet there is a break. When you go and read your Bible, there is a break. It's not continued. There is a story in between the story of Joseph, which is the story of Judah and Tamar. A lot of people ask the question like, why is this in the middle there? There's a lot of theories behind it. But one of the theories is basically starting to tie in the character of Judah and how his personal journey of transformation through the covenant goes through this. So Genesis 37, we see that Judah broke the covenant. He was not his brother's keeper, literally, towards Joseph. And then 38 happens, and Judah was not necessarily the most stellar character because actually he married a Canaanite woman. So very similar to his uncle Esau, who married a Hittite woman, he didn't really care too much. But he married a Canaanite woman. Had his oldest son named Ur married a local girl named Tamar. But the Bible tells us that this older son was wicked. It's the first time since the flood that God actually kills a person. So the oldest son of Judah, God killed him. We don't know why. But with that, there is this what's called the Levirate duty. So it's part of the custom of the duty that when a woman becomes a widow, the brother of the deceased husband, if he's not married, it's his obligation to marry her in order to give her the child and the sustenance. It's called the Levirate marriage. So the second son, whose name is Onan, marries Tamar, but he is even more wicked than his brother because when he's consummating the marriage, he discards his seed. And that is the worst kind of abuse because he's basically abusing her as a woman and yet not fulfilling his duty towards her. He objectified her like in the worst possible way. And because of that, God also killed him because of his evil. Was he his brother's keeper? Absolutely not. He was as worse as Cain, okay, in the sense of sin. So then Judah, probably acting under human fear in contrast to his grandfather Abraham, who gave his only son Isaac, because basically Judah said, maybe there's something wrong with this lady Tamar. You know, she's a curse. Wishawish. Okay? So his youngest son Shelah, who's really young, he told Tamar at that time, you know, Shelah is young, he's not ready to get married. Why don't you go to your father's house, wait, and then when Shelah is of age, we'll get you guys married. So they're technically betrothed. Shelah grows old, and Judah doesn't carry on his promise. Is he acting as his brother's keeper or Tamar, his daughter-in-law? No, he ignores her completely. And then you all know the story. Judah's wife dies, and he goes down to, you know, like it's a feast where they have a lot of sheep, and they're gathering the sheep and grazing the sheep. And he decides to, you know, relieve himself and just, you know, find a prostitute. Tamar knew of that. Okay, and that's kind of the divine providence. Okay, she basically dresses as a prostitute. And that's also another one of the things of like the deception when it works in many ways, whether it's like Jacob and Rachel and Leah. So she dresses as a prostitute. And the Bible tells us that Judah goes into her. And at that time she tells him, "What are you paying me?" And he said, "I don't have anything." But she said, "Okay, give me your ring and your staff." Okay, as kind of like a pledge that you're going to pay me back. And she takes the ring and the staff and just goes back to her father's house. He doesn't find her. But then, obviously, she gets pregnant. And people around is like, come Judah. Your daughter-in-law is playing the harlot. And he literally basically says, bring her out and let her be burned. Bring her out and let her be burned, because she's played the harlot. When she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." And she said, "Please determine whose these are, the signet, which is the ring, the cord, and the staff. So Judah acknowledged them and said, "She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son," and he never knew her again. She's more righteous than I. It is one of the most amazing stories of divine grace, how in the genealogy of Christ, written by St. Matthew, the only women that are mentioned are not Jewish and had shady kind of interactions with men. One of them is Tamar, like specifically, he says, and Judah had with Tamar Perez. He mentions her name as an act of grace and faith, because she acted with that faith. Like in some sense, Matthew's saying she believed in the covenant even though she acted in sin. She believed in the covenant far more than Judah. And isn't it an amazing story of grace that Christ would come out of this? So where does Judah end with this? Well, Judah becomes the Redeemer. We all know the story of Joseph. We know that. So when they kept Simeon and they had to go back to bring Benjamin, and Jacob said, "No, if you take Benjamin, I'm going to die." Judah is the one who stood up and said to him, "I am going to pay for Benjamin." In that, he saved his own people because there was a famine. There was no food. They couldn't just stay where they're at. They needed the food. So he put his life as a surety for Benjamin. But then when they went to Joseph, and we know the story, and Joseph found the cup in Benjamin's sack, Judah is the one who stepped and said to Joseph, "Now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad, and let the lad go up with his brothers." He became the Redeemer. He became the brother's keeper that all the people that followed after Abraham failed to do. And that's one of the reasons why in the prophetic promise, so in the last two chapters, or actually chapter 49, Jacob gives the promises, okay, or the prophecies to the 12 children of Jacob. And Judah said to him, "You are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you." Not Joseph. Judah is a lion's whelp. And as a lion, who shall rouse him? Listen to this. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people." This, even before the time of Christ, was a very, very important messianic prophecy. Because it only comes from one man who learned what the covenant is in order for the Messiah to come from him. And that's one of the reasons why. You think about it actually from an artistic perspective. What is the one structure that the vertical would meet in the center, the horizontal? Literally. Literally. Isn't it poetic that what Christ died on is a structure that the vertical and the horizontal meet together? Isn't it that poetic? So in some sense, through the Messiah, the vertical, God's promise and blessing, and the horizontal, the human responsibility to be one another's keeper, meet in the person of Christ. That's the story of Genesis. So even though the story of Genesis ends with a lot of human mess in this covenant, it ends also with a promise of someone in the line of Judah who will come to restore again the intersections of the vertical and the horizontal. So he becomes actually the figure upon which Genesis ends, not Jacob, not Joseph. And that's a beautiful kind of convergence, because he was able to restore, as a prophetic figure, the horizontal component of being the brother's keeper and being a type for our Savior. So this kind of culminates our series on Genesis. So a lot of themes in there that actually carry on to the rest of the Bible. But I think just to summarize the 5 sessions. Session 1, we talked about how Genesis is a lot about God's character, more so than humanity, especially Genesis 1. Genesis 2, we stressed on the importance of actually that what happened in the Garden of Eden was a transgression and a disobedience according to what our church fathers believed in. Okay, Cain took it further, and that's where the sin started to get worse and worse. Okay, but in a sense also, we also talked about how God's reaction to Adam and Eve was more in the form of teaching, to learn. Okay, death became a way of learning, especially when it's promised with the salvation of Christ. In the 3rd session, we talked a little bit about how when the evil prevailed, God had to recreate through the flood, okay, another creation. But then we went into session 4. Even with a new creation, God did not rest. Remember, I said there was no Sabbath after, the recreation of the flood. So God had to figure out a way to handle his presence among the universality of sin amongst this cursed earth. And the answer was, in contrast to the Tower of Babel that were trying to reach the heavens to make a name for themselves, God initiates a divine covenant with Abraham, gives him and Sarah a new name that we talked about, and children as the stars of the heaven. But then we realize the covenant is not an easy thing. A covenant, to be a channel of transformation and blessing, needs a lot of human responsibility. That's the synergy. So as we take this covenant to ourselves, we have now been given the new covenant. Okay? This is the new covenant, right? Shed for you and for many. It is not a magical potion that we just say, okay, our lives are changed. But yet it is an invitation for transformation through learning through our choices, because God lets us out of his grace for us to go through our free choices, our free will, but also realizing that our free will is the avenue through which we grow. Because when we make our choices, whether good or bad, our lives are transformed. But the end result of this covenant is the question, am I my brother's keeper? So as I come to church, now it makes sense why Christ said, if you come to offer your offering and you have something with your brother, leave the offering, go and have peace with your brother before you come to the offering. Now it makes sense why we have the kiss of peace before we ask God at that point, okay, for the coming down of the Holy Spirit on the gifts to become the body and blood of Christ. Because other than this, we are not keeping the covenant. That's the story of Genesis. And we'll see you guys in January when we go into Exodus. It will be 5 times as well. Thank you for... I know this was long, but this I want just to wrap it up to you. Okay, questions? Yes?
You took away the title from Judah, yet to me, he is the best of all his brothers. In this the mess that happened, he saved his brother. He was putting his life on the line. He was the best. As a matter of fact, you called him the Redeemer. Why you took away title brother keeper from him? I mean, all what his acts was in a brotherly manner, brotherly, loving to his siblings.
So Judah in the beginning of his life was not his brother's keeper. So when he sold, instead of standing up for his brothers and defending Joseph, He's the one who made the suggestion to sell. So he didn't defend Joseph in Genesis 37.
Than letting him die.
That's true, but also could have defended him, okay, and saved him at that point. Maybe yes, maybe no. But also with the story of Tamar, okay, not acting in Tamar's best interest, and she's the weak one. Okay, he didn't act as his brother's keeper, where Tamar, his daughter-in-law, is considered to be his brother in humanity, if I may say. So he didn't act in her best interest, and that's kind of the point of transformation. When he saw her righteousness, something changed in him. So that's one of the reasons why some of the commentators feel that the story of Judah was interspaced in that part of Joseph to denote his change of heart. Okay, that 37, he sells his brother. He couldn't stand up for him the way that he may have, because he's described as a lion. Okay, he didn't stand up as he should have. Okay, 38, he has a change of heart prompted by the righteousness of Tamar. Comes back as now his brother's keeper. So, in fact, I'm making him that Jacob's life was not transformed in the way that it should have been, because he had a lot of baggage, had a lot of bad choices. Okay? And he never felt at the end that it was a blessing. On the contrast, Judah might have made some mistakes, but he was transformed into the true brother's keeper eventually. And that's why he became the prophetic figure. Okay? So that's kind of why I'm saying like that transformation. I love the story of transformation, because that's what the covenant does to us. It transforms us, where it takes our mistakes and our bad decisions. We learn when we see God's righteousness through his acts with us, as well as the righteousness of those around us, and our lives become transformed at that point. So he earned it. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, well, it's just because people online, so, or I can repeat it, but like you'll get the microphone.
So why was the deceiving part still something like, I know they want to earn the covenant, they want to keep it, but why was the deceiving part still a good thing? Or as you're saying it, like it's in the process of reaching their goal, but it's
not a good thing. So here's the thing. God guarantees the promise of blessing especially when it comes to the economy of salvation, like through the promise that he gave to Abraham, the blessing was to all humanity. But that never from the consequences of their wrong choices. So in them desiring the covenant, which was good in itself, the fact that they deceived to get it didn't protect them from the mistakes of that. So did Jacob get the blessing of the covenant? He did get it in the multiplication of his family. He was the first one to actually have such a large family. But did he enjoy that blessing? Clearly, in his answer to Pharaoh, he didn't enjoy it. And through his children, God blessed the whole people of Israel as well as the whole world. Okay? But as a person, he struggled and suffered because of his wrong decisions. So that's what I was trying to get into the covenant. The covenant, God promises something within the covenant, but will never protect us from our wrong choices, because through our wrong choices, we get to have the choice to be either transformed or not. And when we live the consequences of our wrong choices, it's our chance to then become transformed into the saintly figure that God wants us to be. Okay, and that's why I'm giving that kind of contrast between Jacob and Judah. Yes? Sure, you're welcome. Go ahead, Paul.
Comment on the reconciliation, because I think it's important, is even liturgically in history, the prayer of reconciliation isn't where it is today in the liturgy.
Tell me more about it. I'd actually like to learn more about it.
Yeah, so the prayer of reconciliation actually occurred even before the offering of the lamb, for the exact reason that you even prescribed, which was that we are not even to go to our offering unless there was reconciliation.
Reconciliation.
Exactly.
It's
So
amazing.
liturgically in history, well, obviously now because we have the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the believers after, we put it after the creed because we shouldn't be partaking of the offering unless you're a believer.
Okay.
But that wasn't an issue in the early church. Everybody that was partaking was a believer. So that wasn't really a situation. So even kind
Thank
of
you.
to further the point that you're saying, it's that important that the prayer of reconciliation was the first thing that we would do.
Yeah.
Even before the offering of the lamb. The other thing I want to comment on is that even when we look at Good Friday, even when we think about Thoktatigom, the last part that we put, you have become our holy salvation. This whole idea of that last part is that God was the only one who prescribed the covenant and could keep the covenant in
Yes.
order for us to even have salvation. Every human that tried to fulfill the covenant fell short, as you described that length.
Which actually they emphasize the whole point of like the walking, in the covenant with Abraham, that Abraham didn't walk. So humanity doesn't walk through this, okay? And we'll never be able to do that. Yet if we as people want to live the blessing of this covenant and be the channel, it's going to depend on our obedience and following on this covenant, especially as it comes to becoming our brother's keeper.
And I think that even Christ says it, right, is that greater love has no one than this than to lay down his life for one's friend.
Amen.
I think that's exactly the definition of being a brother's keeper.
Yeah.
So I think Christ really embodied everything that you're describing. Every single person was good. The patriarchs, they kind of got a bad rap a little bit during this talk, I feel like, especially Jacob, is that they're good, but they fell short in a lot of capacities because they're not.
And I think this is the beauty of them, is that when you start to see even with their struggle, that you get the figure of Judah in its prophetic existence. Okay, it becomes the prophecy of Christ, where this becomes a messianic prophecy for him, which is the beauty that Christ gives us the prophecy in the midst of our human mess. That's the story of Christ being born in Bethlehem. He's born in the midst of our human mess. So in the midst of this family drama, literally family drama, he's giving the prophecy of redemption. But, as I said, the theme that ties it in is being your brother's keeper. Any final questions, comments? Amazing. All right, thank you guys for staying with me. So let's just pray and we'll call it a night. Make us worthy to pray, our Father.